Imagine a world where everything that happens, from the tiniest flutter of a butterfly's wings to the most catastrophic natural disaster, is part of a grand story written by a divine author. Now, picture this author as the ultimate creator, the one who not only writes the story but also brings it to life. This is the world of Calvinism, a branch of Christian theology that believes God has a plan for everything down to the last detail. But what if this plan includes sin, the very thing that goes against God's perfect nature? Does this mean that God, the ultimate author, is responsible for the evil in the world? This question has haunted theologians and philosophers for centuries. It's a shocking idea, one that seems to contradict the very essence of a good and loving God. How can the creator of the universe, who is supposed to be all-powerful and all-good, be the one who sets the stage for sin and suffering? To understand this, we need to dive into the heart of Calvinism. According to Calvinists, God is not just a passive observer of the world. He is the active author of everything that happens. This means that every event, every choice, and every action is part of God's plan. But this raises a critical question. If God is the author of everything, does that make him the author of sin? At first glance, it seems like a straightforward answer, yes. If God is the one who writes the story, and sin is part of the story, then God must be the one who wrote the sin into the script. But is it really that simple? Let's explore this idea further. Imagine a novelist writing a book. The novelist creates characters, places, and events, and decides how the story will unfold. The characters in the book might do terrible things, but the novelist is not morally responsible for those actions. The characters are free to make their own choices within the story, even if those choices are evil. The novelist is the creator, but the characters are the ones who act. Now, apply this to God. If God is the author of the universe, he creates a world where his creatures have the freedom to make choices. Some of these choices are good, and some are bad. But just because God is the author, does that mean he is responsible for the bad choices? Not necessarily. Just like the novelist, God can create a world where his creatures have the freedom to choose, even if those choices lead to sin. But there's a crucial difference between a human novelist and God. A human novelist's story is just a story. It doesn't really exist outside the pages of the book. God, on the other hand, has the power to bring his story to life. When God writes the story of the universe, it becomes real. This is what theologians call divine causation. God's creative power is unique. He can make his story come true in a way that a human author cannot. So, when we say that God is the author of the universe, we mean that he has the power to bring his story to life, including the parts where his creatures sin. But this doesn't mean that God is the one who commits the sins. The sin is always a choice made by the creature, not by God. God is the one who sets the stage, but the actors on that stage are free to make their own choices. This idea is at the core of the authorial model of providence, a way of understanding how God's sovereignty and human freedom can coexist. According to this model, God is the ultimate author, but he allows his creatures to have real freedom within the story. This means that while God foreordains everything, he does not cause sin in the same way that a human author might write a character to do something evil. But what about the first sin, the one committed by Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden? If God foreordained everything, why did he allow the first sin to happen? This is one of the most challenging questions for Calvinists. Some argue that Adam and Eve were free to choose, even though God knew what they would choose. Others suggest that the first sin was a result of a unique kind of freedom, one that allowed for the possibility of sin without God being the one who caused it. The idea of God being the author of sin is a complex and often misunderstood concept. It's easy to jump to the conclusion that if God is the author, he must be responsible for the evil in the world. But the authorial model offers a different perspective. It suggests that God's role as the author is more nuanced and that the responsibility for sin lies with the creatures who commit it, not with the author who created them. As we delve deeper into this idea, we'll explore the challenges and objections that Calvinism faces, particularly when it comes to the first sin. We'll also look at how Calvinists respond to these challenges and what this means for our understanding of God's role in the world. But for now, let's keep this shocking idea in mind. God is the author of the universe, but he is not the author of sin. The story of the universe is a complex one, and the role of the author is more intricate than it might seem at first glance. If we dive into the heart of the matter, we find a fascinating debate about human freedom and divine sovereignty. At the center of this debate is the question of how Adam, the first human, could have freely chosen to sin, especially if God knew everything that would happen. Let's break this down into simpler terms. Aristotle, an ancient Greek philosopher, talked about two important concepts: akrasia and enkrateia. Akrasia is when you do something you know is wrong, even though you think it's better to do the right thing. For example, you might eat a whole cake even though you know it's not good for you. Enkrateia, on the other hand, is when you resist temptation and do what you know is right. Imagine resisting that cake because you know it's better to eat a salad. Now, let's apply this to Adam's sin. Some people, called Calvinists, believe that God planned everything that would happen, including Adam's sin. They argue that Adam's sin was a free choice even though God knew it would happen. This idea can be tricky, but it's not impossible. Imagine a really smart chess player who can predict every move their opponent will make. The opponent still makes free choices, but the smart player knows what those choices will be. Calvinists might say that Adam's sin was a moment of akrasia. He knew it was wrong to eat the forbidden fruit, but he did it anyway. Even though God knew Adam would do this, Adam still made a free choice. This doesn't mean God made Adam sin. It just means God knew it would happen. But what if this explanation doesn't work? Some people argue that if Adam was sinless, he shouldn't have been able to choose to sin. If that's the case, maybe we have to accept that the first sin is a mystery. This idea isn't unique to Calvinism. Other Christian traditions, like Molinists, those who believe in simple foreknowledge, and open theists, also struggle with this mystery. Molinists believe that God has a special kind of knowledge called middle knowledge. This means God knows what free choices people would make in different situations. For example, God might know that if Adam was in the Garden of Eden and tempted by Satan, he would sin. This way, God can create a world where Adam will sin, but Adam still makes a free choice. The problem with this is that it's hard to understand how God can know these things before creating the world. It's like knowing the outcome of a coin flip before you flip. How can God know what Adam would do if Adam hasn't even been created yet? Simple foreknowledge is a bit different. This view says God doesn't know what free choices people will make before creating the world. But once the world is created, God knows everything that will happen. So God knew Adam would sin after creating him, but not before. This avoids some of the problems with middle knowledge, but it still raises questions about how God's knowledge of the future can be compatible with human free will. Open theists take a different approach. They believe that the future is open and not determined. God doesn't know everything that will happen, but He knows all the possibilities. God decided to create a world with free beings, knowing that they might sin, but not knowing for sure that they would. This view emphasizes the importance of free will and the value of genuine relationships between God and humans. Each of these views has its own challenges. Calvinists have to explain how God's foreknowledge and sovereignty are compatible with human free will. Molinists have to explain how God can know what free choices people will make before they exist. Simple foreknowledge has to explain how God's knowledge of the future doesn't make human choices predetermined. Open theists have to explain how a God who doesn't know the future can be all-knowing. In the end, all these views have to appeal to some level of mystery. The first sin is a profound and complex issue, and no single explanation can fully answer all the questions. What's important is that each view tries to make sense of the relationship between God's sovereignty and human free will in its own way. Whether you agree with Calvinism, Molinism, simple foreknowledge, or open theism, the debate itself is a reminder of the deep and mysterious nature of God and the human experience. When we think about God's knowledge and His role in creating the world, we encounter some tricky questions. One of these questions is about God's foreknowledge, His ability to know everything that will happen in the future. This becomes especially challenging when we consider the idea of human free will, the ability to make choices freely. Imagine God deciding to create the world. If humans have free will, God can't know for sure what they will do until they actually do it. This means that God's decision to create the world is somewhat blind. He can only predict what might happen, not what will definitely happen. Once the world is created and history unfolds, God can then know everything that has happened and will happen. But by then, it's too late to change anything. This presents a problem for the idea of God's providence, which is His ability to guide and control everything that happens. If God can't know in advance what will happen, He can't plan and control events as precisely as we might expect from an all-powerful and all-knowing God. For example, if God couldn't foresee the first sin, He couldn't prevent it. Once He knows about it, it's already part of history and can't be changed. This issue also affects the idea of God's freedom. If God already knows everything that will happen, His decision to create the world would be fixed by that knowledge. This means He wouldn't be free to choose differently. This is a big problem because it suggests that God's decisions are limited by His own knowledge. Another view, called open theism, tries to solve this by saying that God doesn't know the future in detail. Instead, He knows all the possibilities and can respond to events as they happen. This means God is more like a cosmic parent who can adapt and react to the choices His children make. However, this view has its own problems. It portrays God as a gambler who takes big risks with the lives of His creatures. If God can't predict whether humans will choose good or evil, He's taking a huge risk. If things go badly, it's the creatures who suffer the most, not God. This doesn't seem to fit with the idea of a good and wise God. In human affairs, we don't think highly of people who take big risks with others' lives without their consent. So, it's hard to see why we should think well of a God who does the same. Calvinism, on the other hand, offers a different perspective. According to Calvinism, God has a detailed plan for everything that happens, including the first sin. This means that God's knowledge and control are complete. While this might seem mysterious, it avoids the problems of God being a gambler or having limited control. God's plan is good and wise, even if we can't fully understand it. Calvinism also emphasizes God's independence and self-existence. There are no events in the world that happen outside of God's will. His knowledge doesn't depend on anything in the world. It's complete and perfect. This means God doesn't have to take risks or rely on good fortune. Everything happens according to His plan, which is designed to show His glory and achieve His purposes. In the end, each view has its strengths and weaknesses. Calvinism might seem mysterious, but it offers a coherent and consistent picture of God's nature and His role in the world. It avoids the problems of God being a gambler or having limited control. While it might not satisfy every question, it provides a solid foundation for understanding God's providence and the first sin. The debate about God's foreknowledge and creation is complex, but it's important to consider all the angles. Each view has its own way of explaining how God's knowledge and control work, and each has its own set of challenges. By comparing these views, we can gain a deeper understanding of the nature of God and the world He created. In the world of theology, there's a big debate about whether the first human Adam was a real person or just a symbolic figure. Many modern theologians think Adam wasn't a real person because of what science tells us about human evolution. But some people, like me, believe that Adam was real and that his actions had real consequences. Even if you deny that Adam was a real person, you can't avoid the problem of the first human sin. At some point, there were no humans, and then at some later point, there was a human who sinned. This means that the problem of the first sin still needs to be addressed, whether Adam was real or not. Some theologians and scientists have written books defending the idea that Adam was a real person. For example, Collins wrote, "Did Adam and Eve really exist?" And Rana and Ross wrote, "Who was Adam?" These books provide both theological and scientific arguments for the historicity of Adam. Now, let's talk about a different issue. The idea that everything is determined by God. This is a view held by some Calvinists, who believe that God has determined everything that happens, including human actions. This idea can be a bit tricky, because it raises questions about free will and moral responsibility. If everything is determined, how can we be held responsible for our actions? Some philosophers have argued that determinism, the idea that everything is determined, is not compatible with the kind of freedom that allows us to choose differently in the same circumstances. However, they also argue that determinism can still be compatible with moral responsibility as long as certain conditions are met. This view is called semi-compatibilism. For simplicity, I'll just call it compatibilism in this chapter. There are some famous arguments against compatibilism, like the consequence argument and the manipulation argument. These arguments try to show that if determinism is true, then we can't be held morally responsible for our actions. But compatibilists have developed responses to these arguments, and the debate is still ongoing. One of the key points in this debate is whether God's determination of everything means that we can't be morally responsible for our actions. Some Calvinists, like John Calvin and the authors of the Westminster Confession of Faith, believed in divine determinism. They thought that God's determination of everything doesn't undermine our moral responsibility. But what if you're not sure about this? What if you think that Calvinism is committed to divine determinism, but you're worried about the implications for human freedom and moral responsibility? That's a valid concern, and it's something that many people have thought about. One way to think about this is to consider the idea of intramundane causation. This means that God's causation of events happens within the world, not outside of it. For example, when a person makes a choice, God's causation is part of the process, but it doesn't mean that the person isn't responsible for their choice. Another way to think about it is to use an analogy. Imagine a writer who creates a story. The writer decides what happens in the story, but the characters in the story still make choices and are responsible for those choices. In a similar way, God can be seen as the author of the world, and we are the characters who make choices and are responsible for them. Some people might object that in a story, the author's role is different from God's role in the world. In a story, the author is not a part of the story, but God is a part of the world. However, in the authorial model, God's role as the author of the world is distinct from his role as a character in the world. This helps to clarify the relationship between God's causation and human responsibility. Another important point is that even if God determines everything, it doesn't mean that our choices are random or uncaused. Our choices are still based on our reasons, desires, and motivations. This means that our choices are not just the result of luck or chance. In the end, the debate about determinism and free will is complex, and there are many different views. Some people think that determinism is compatible with moral responsibility, while others think it isn't. The key is to think carefully about what kind of freedom is necessary for moral responsibility, and to consider the different arguments and models that have been proposed. For example, some Calvinists have argued that God's causation of human actions is different from the causation of natural events. They believe that God's causation of human actions is more like a writer guiding the actions of characters in a story, rather than a mechanical cause and effect relationship. So when we think about the historicity of Adam and the idea of divine determinism, we need to consider how these ideas fit together. Even if Adam was a real person, the problem of the first sin and moral responsibility still needs to be addressed. And even if everything is determined by God, it doesn't necessarily mean that we can't be held responsible for our actions. The debate is ongoing, and there are many different perspectives to consider. But by thinking carefully about these issues, we can gain a deeper understanding of the relationship between God, human freedom, and moral responsibility. Some people believe that God exists and that freedom and responsibility are important. They think that God can't control everything because that would take away our freedom to choose. But others, called Calvinists, believe that God is in control of everything, even our choices, and that this doesn't take away our responsibility. Calvinists use a document called the Westminster Shorter Catechism to explain their beliefs. It says that God has a plan for everything that happens, and that He is in charge of all actions, even the bad ones. This raises a big question. If God is in control of everything, why is there evil in the world? One way to think about this is to consider the idea of demonstrative goods. This means that sometimes bad things can show us something important about God. For example, in the Bible there are stories where bad things happen, but they end up showing us something about God's character. Here are a few examples. The man born blind, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says that a man was born blind not because of his or his parents' sins, but to show God's power. When Jesus heals the man, it demonstrates God's ability to bring good out of bad situations. Pharaoh and the Israelites. In the book of Exodus, God hardens Pharaoh's heart, leading to the Israelites' suffering. But this also shows God's power and His ability to deliver His people from oppression. Lazarus' death. In John, Jesus lets Lazarus die to show His power over death. When Jesus raises Lazarus, It demonstrates that he is the source of life. Paul's persecution. In 1 Timothy, Paul talks about how he used to persecute Christians. But God showed mercy to Paul, turning him into one of the most important figures in early Christianity. This shows God's grace and patience. The death of Jesus. In Romans, Paul explains that Jesus died to show God's righteousness and to make it possible for people to be forgiven. This demonstrates God's love and justice, the rebellious life of the saved. The Bible talks about how people who have lived rebellious lives can be saved and transformed. This shows God's power to change hearts and lives. These examples show that even bad things can have a purpose. They can reveal something about God's character, His justice, power, and grace. This doesn't mean that all bad things are good, but it does mean that God can use bad things to show us who He is. Calvinists believe that God has a reason for everything, even if we don't understand it. They argue that God's control over everything, including our choices, doesn't mean He is responsible for the bad things we do. Instead, they say that God can use our choices to show His character in ways that would be impossible if everything was always good. This idea helps Calvinists explain why there is evil in the world. They believe that God can use even the worst situations to show His love and power. So, while it might be hard to understand why bad things happen, Calvinists believe that God has a plan, and that His plan can bring good out of evil. Imagine a world where everything is perfect and there's no evil or suffering. Sounds great, right? But what if this perfect world meant that we couldn't truly understand the value of goodness or the depth of God's love and justice? This is a big question that many people, especially those who believe in God, grapple with. Let's dive into this idea, using some examples from the Bible and some thoughts from philosophers. In the book of Ephesians, the Apostle Paul talks about how we were once dead in our sins, living in a world that was far from God. But God, in His great mercy, brought us to life with Christ, showing us His incredible grace. This grace is demonstrated through the way God forgives and transforms us, even when we don't deserve it. But what about the evil in the world? Why does God allow bad things to happen if He is all good and all-powerful? One way to think about this is through the idea of demonstrative goods. A demonstrative good is something that helps us understand a truth more deeply. For example, imagine you're learning to play a musical instrument. Reading about it is helpful, but actually playing it and making mistakes is what really teaches you. In the same way, experiencing or witnessing evil can help us understand the value of goodness and the importance of God's justice and grace. Take the example of Hitler. His actions were incredibly evil, and many people suffered because of him. But in a strange way, his existence and the consequences of his actions help us see the seriousness of evil and the justice of God's judgment. If Hitler had never existed, we might not fully grasp the depth of God's love and mercy, or the importance of choosing good over evil. This doesn't mean that the suffering of others is justified, but it does suggest that even in the darkest moments there can be a deeper purpose. Now you might ask, why not just put evildoers in a sandbox where they can't hurt anyone? This is a good question. One reason is that our understanding of evil is much more powerful when we see its effects. When we see the harm that evil causes, we can better understand why it is so wrong and why God's judgment is just. For example, in the story of Saul, who later became the Apostle Paul, his persecution of Christians showed the depth of his wickedness. But when he repented and became a follower of Christ, it demonstrated the power of God's grace and forgiveness. Another reason is that experiencing the effects of evil can help us understand our need for God. In his book, The Problem of Evil, Peter Van Inwagen suggests that for people to truly understand their need for God, they must see the consequences of living without Him. This can be a powerful motivator for seeking God and understanding the importance of His presence in our lives. But what about the value of these demonstrations? Can they really be worth the cost of so much suffering? It's a tough question, and one that even theists, people who believe in God, debate. The key is that we often don't see the full picture. We don't know how many people might learn from these demonstrations, or how they might benefit in the long run. For example, the story of Job in the Bible shows that even when we suffer, there can be a greater purpose. God allowed Job to suffer to demonstrate his faithfulness and to show the depth of Job's devotion. Moreover, the future is uncertain. We don't know what God might do to compensate for the suffering of individuals. The idea of resurrection and eternal life suggests that God might have plans to make things right in the end. This means that even if we can't see the good in the present, there might be a greater good that we can't fully understand yet. When it comes to animal suffering, some argue that it's necessary to maintain the regularity of the world. For example, the laws of nature which God established might require certain forms of suffering to keep the world stable. This can be seen as a way of demonstrating God's faithfulness and the order He has created. In the book of Hebrews, animal sacrifices are described as a reminder of sins, which is another way of demonstrating the importance of seeking forgiveness and living a righteous life. In the end, the distribution of evil and suffering is a complex issue. We might not understand why certain people suffer more than others, but our lack of knowledge about the future means we can't say for sure that anyone's suffering will go uncompensated. This is where faith comes in. Trusting that God has a plan, even when we can't see it, is a central part of many religious beliefs. The idea of demonstrative goods offers a way to think about the problem of evil that doesn't rely on the concept of free will. It suggests that even in the midst of suffering, there can be a deeper purpose that helps us understand the world and our place in it. While this doesn't answer all the questions, it provides a framework for thinking about why evil exists and how it might serve a greater good. Imagine a world where everything that happens is planned by a powerful being, God. Calvinists. A group of Christians believe that God decides everything, from the tiniest details to the biggest events. Think God causes every single thing that happens, either directly or through other things He sets in motion. On the other hand, Arminians, another group of Christians, believe that people have free will and can make choices that God doesn't control. They think that for someone to be morally responsible for their actions, those actions must be free and not determined by God. This difference in beliefs leads to a big question. If God has control over everything, why would He create a place like hell where people suffer forever? For Calvinists, this is a tough question because it seems unfair for God to create people and then decide that some of them will suffer eternally. Arminians who believe in free will can say that people choose to go to hell, and God respects their choice. But Calvinists can't use this explanation because they believe God decides everything. One way Calvinists try to answer this question is by saying that God has a plan, and this plan includes some people going to hell. They believe that God's plan is to show His glory and justice. For example, the theologian John Calvin said that some people were created to show God's glory through their punishment. The Westminster Confession, a set of beliefs written by Calvinists, says that God decided to let some people go to hell to show His power and justice. But why would God need to create people who will go to hell to show His glory? One idea is that the people in heaven need to understand God's nature fully. If everyone went to heaven, the people there might not fully appreciate God's justice and power. By having some people in hell, the people in heaven can see the consequences of rejecting God and understand why God is just and powerful. Think about it like this. If you've never seen a bad thing happen, you might not fully understand what it means to do good. In the same way, if everyone went to heaven, the people there might not fully understand why God is just and why it's important to follow His rules. By having some people in hell, the people in heaven can see the importance of God's justice and appreciate His mercy more. Another idea is that the people in hell help the people in heaven to have the right attitude towards God. If everyone went to heaven, the people there might take God's mercy for granted. But by seeing the consequences of rejecting God, the people in heaven can be more grateful and more committed to following God's ways. Some people might still think this is unfair. They might ask, why would God create people just to send them to hell? But Calvinists would say that God's plan is bigger than we can understand. They believe that even though it seems unfair to us, God has a good reason for everything He does. They might also say that we can't fully understand God's reasons, just like we can't fully understand everything in the universe. In the end, the question of why God would create a place like hell is a difficult one. Calvinists try to explain it by saying that God's plan includes showing His glory and justice, and that this plan helps the people in heaven to understand God better. While this might not be a satisfying answer for everyone, it's one way Calvinists try to make sense of a difficult idea. In this part of the book, we explore a complex question. Why would God, who is all good, allow some people to go to hell? This is a tough topic, and we need to think carefully about it. We'll look at what some people believe and why they think it might make sense. First, let's understand that for something to be a good reason for God to allow someone to go to hell, it must meet two conditions. First, the good thing must require that some people go to hell. Second, the good thing must be worth the evil that comes with it. If these two conditions aren't met, then the reason isn't strong enough. Now, let's look at what some people, called Calvinists, believe. A famous Calvinist, John Piper, says that God wants to show the full range of His glory, including His wrath and mercy. This means that God might allow some people to go to hell, so that those in heaven can better understand and appreciate God's justice and mercy. However, this idea has been challenged. Some say that God can show His wrath and justice through Jesus' suffering on the cross, so there's no need for anyone else to go to hell. But is this really true? Another theologian, Oliver Crisp, initially thought so, but later changed his mind. He realized that there's a difference between seeing God's wrath on someone who deserves it and seeing it on someone who doesn't. Jesus didn't deserve to suffer, but sinners do. So, seeing God's wrath on sinners might give a clearer picture of justice. Here are some reasons why God might allow people to go to hell, according to this view. An organic spectacle. People in heaven might see God's justice being carried out in real time, which is more powerful than just remembering it from the past. Understanding justice. If only Jesus suffered, we wouldn't see the different punishments for different sins. Seeing the punishment of various sins helps us understand justice better, perceiving God's majesty. The eternal punishment of sinners shows how serious it is to offend God, which helps us understand how great and majestic God is. Gratitude for salvation. Seeing the punishment of others makes the elect in heaven more grateful for their salvation. It's like being more thankful for a good meal when you see others who are hungry. But these reasons might only justify a small number of people going to hell. what about the many more who might be reprobated? Here are some additional reasons. Gratitude through likelihood. If many people are reprobated, it makes the elect more grateful because they realize how close they were to the same fate. It's like being more grateful for surviving a disaster when you see others who didn't. Gratitude through rarity. If salvation is rare, it makes it more valuable. It's like being more grateful for a special invitation to a party when you know many others didn't get one. Focus on salvation. If most people are reprobated, it makes people more focused on their own salvation. This is important because relating to God is the most important thing in life. Historical importance. If most people are reprobated, the history of humanity will focus more on the importance of salvation. This keeps the focus on the most important aspect of human life. In the end, these reasons try to show that even though the idea of people going to hell is very difficult, there might be good reasons for it that we can understand. However, these reasons are complex, and not everyone agrees with them. The important thing is to think deeply about these ideas and consider what they mean for our understanding of God and our place in the world.